In every monster story, there's a beginning. Not the moment of the first crime, but the moment of the first wound. Before Ed Kemper became the so-called co-ed killer, before the world would come to fear his calm voice and chilling confessions, he was just a boy born into violence, rejection, and silence. Edmund Emil Kemper III entered the world on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, the middle child of Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Jr. from the very start. The house he called home was less of a shelter and more of a battlefield. His father, a World War II veteran, was strict but distant. His mother, Clarnell, was something else entirely. She was cold, controlling, and cruel, a woman who belittled her son, mocked him for his size, and told him over and over that no woman could ever love him. "You remind me of your father," she'd hiss. "You'll grow up worthless, just like him." Ed was a big kid. Too big, too soon. By age 10, he was already taller than his teachers, awkward, quiet, and constantly ridiculed by his classmates. But the real torment came at home. Clarnell locked him in the basement at night, a dark, concrete dungeon where rats scurried and the single bulb flickered weakly. She claimed she feared he might harm his sisters, yet it was she who planted the idea that he was dangerous. "You'll hurt someone one day," she said. "There's something wrong with you." And little by little, those words became prophecy. Inside that cold basement, Ed began to imagine things, fantasies that blurred the line between death and control. He dissected his sister's dolls, tore the heads off their toys, and buried the family's pet cat alive, just to dig it up later. When asked why he did it, he'd simply say, "I wanted to see what it looked like when it stopped moving." It wasn't just curiosity, it was rage without direction, a rage born from humiliation, loneliness, and a need to reclaim power. At home, his mother's words were knives. At school, his size made him a target. So he turned inward, into a world where he could be the one in control. By 13, Ed had begun to dream of killing his mother, not out of sudden hatred, but out of something worse, inevitability. "I knew what she was doing to me," he later said, "but I couldn't stop it. And one day, I knew I'd have to end it." When his parents finally divorced, the damage was already done. His father remarried and moved away, leaving Ed with the one person he feared and hated most, his mother. Clarnell moved the family to Helena, Montana, taking Ed far from the one man who might have been his only grounding force. She drank heavily. She screamed constantly. She reminded her son every day that he was a burden, and Ed learned early that love was punishment. That affection was conditional. That pain was normal. He tried to escape, in his mind, through fantasy. But fantasy, as it often does, began to consume reality. By the time Ed turned 14, he stood 6'4", a boy's mind trapped inside a man's frame, and no place left for his anger to go. So, in 1963, he ran away from home to find his father in California. But when he arrived, he found another family in his place. His father had moved on. Ed was unwanted. Again, that night, something broke. His father refused to take him in, sending him instead to live with his grandparents on a ranch in North Fork. To most people, that might have seemed like salvation. To Ed, it was exile. His grandmother, Maud Kemper, was strict and dismissive, a reflection of his mother in every way. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was quiet and aging, and in that small rural home, far from anyone who might listen, the cycle of rejection began again. "She'd tell me I was worthless," he recalled later. "She'd say, 'You're just like your mother.'" To a boy who had been told his whole life that he was a monster, those words were gasoline to a fire that had been burning for years. And then, one summer afternoon, that fire finally erupted. How childhood rage becomes lethal. The first murders that shaped Ed Kemper's psychology forever. North Fork, California, August 1964. 15-year-old Ed Kemper stands in the kitchen of his grandparents' farmhouse. The late summer air is heavy, still, almost choking in its silence. His grandmother, Maud, sits at the table, a typewriter before her, a cup of coffee cooling at her elbow. She glances at Ed and shakes her head. "You're getting just like your mother," she says. That sentence, those 6 words, are the final match. For years, Ed had swallowed his anger. He'd smiled when she mocked him, bit his tongue when she laughed at his size, when she told him no girl would ever want him. But on this day, something inside him shifts. He walks to the rifle his grandfather keeps for varmints, a .22 caliber. He lifts it, as if testing the weight of what's about to happen. "I didn't want to hear it anymore," he would later tell police. "It felt like I was being pushed off a cliff I've been standing on my whole life." He points the gun at Maud and pulls the trigger. One shot, then another, then another. Maud slumps forward over her typewriter. A page half-typed, a sentence unfinished. Silence, then footsteps. The crunch of gravel outside. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., returns from buying groceries. Ed meets him in the driveway. He doesn't say a word. He raises the rifle and fires. "I didn't want him to see what I did to Grandma," Ed later said, "so I shot him too." At 15 years old, Ed Kemper had committed double murder, the very prophecy his mother had whispered into his childhood. But what's most chilling isn't the act itself. It's what he did after. He called his mother, the same woman whose abuse shaped his rage, and told her, calmly, "I just killed Grandma and Grandpa." His mother told him to call the police. And he did. There was no chase, no denial, no emotion. Just a boy whose life of silence had finally produced a scream loud enough for the world to hear. At his trial, psychologists were baffled. Ed's IQ tested at 136, near genius level. He wasn't insane, they said. He was just empty, one psychiatrist wrote. He shows no empathy, no visible remorse, but speaks of his crimes as though describing a science experiment. Because of his age, Ed wasn't sent to prison. Instead, he was committed to a Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, a place filled with men twice his age, many of them violent offenders. But Ed wasn't afraid. In fact, he thrived. Inside those walls, he learned about psychology, manipulation, and human behavior. He studied case files. He listened to other inmates' confessions. He even assisted doctors in administering psychiatric tests, tests that would later be used to measure him. And he learned quickly. He learned what to say. He learned what remorse looked like. He learned what doctors wanted to hear. "I was the perfect student," he'd later say. "I learned how to act normal." By 1969, at age 21, doctors deemed him rehabilitated, reformed, even, they wrote in their reports that he posed no further threat to society. He was released back into the world, back to his mother. The cycle began again. Clarnell, now living in Santa Cruz, had remarried and divorced again. She worked at the University of California. Surrounded by the young women she claimed her son would never attract. To Ed, they were everything he could never have: confidence, beauty, freedom. To his mind, they were proof that his mother had been right all along. He was 6'9" now, quiet, polite, intelligent, the kind of man who could disappear in plain sight. And though he tried to live normally, working odd jobs, attending community college, the resentment festered. He started picking up hitchhikers. At first, it was harmless, or so he told himself. He'd drive them where they needed to go, watch them walk away, and imagine what it would be like if they didn't. "I'd let them out," he said later. "Then I'd drive off angry that I didn't do it." That anger built until fantasy no longer satisfied him, until curiosity became compulsion. He bought a .22 pistol, knives, and handcuffs. He practiced locking and unlocking the cuffs without looking. He installed a switch in his car to disable the passenger door handle. And he waited. "I'd drive along Highway 1, he said. The coastline was beautiful, and I'd think about death. When the missing persons reports came in, no one suspected Ed. He was polite, articulate, even charming. He hung around the police at local bars, discussing the murders like any curious citizen would. No one looked at the giant man with the friendly smile and saw the boy who once lived in a basement. No one saw the echo of a mother's cruelty in every act of violence he committed. And no one, not even Ed himself, could stop what was coming next. The escalation, the pattern, The moment Ed Kemper crossed from fantasy to full-blown serial murder, and the psychology that drove him there. By the summer of 1972, the highways around Santa Cruz were crawling with hitchhikers, students, drifters, dreamers. It was the height of California's free spirit era, when a smile and a thumb could get you anywhere. For Ed Kemper, those roads were hunting grounds. He'd spent months rehearsing, studying body language, rehearsing conversations in the mirror, planning every possible scenario. He even kept maps of rural backroads, places the police wouldn't patrol, places where screams would vanish into wind. When he finally acted, it was almost surgical. The fantasy had become a formula. May 7th, 1972, Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, two college students heading to Stanford. Ed offered them a ride, smiling through the passenger window. They saw a tall, clean-cut man with kind eyes and a calm voice. They didn't see the gun under the seat. Halfway through the trip, Ed turned off the main highway. When Marion realized they were lost, panic set in. She reached for the door, but the handle had been disabled. That small mechanical switch sealed their fate. In the isolated woods near Alameda, Ed Kemper killed both girls, strangling one, stabbing the other. He later said it was almost mechanical. He took their bodies home, to his mother's house. There, in the very place where he'd been belittled for years, he began the ritual that would define his crimes. I wanted to make them stay, he said, just for a while. He kept them hidden in his room, treating the corpses like silent companions. When his mother knocked on the door that night and asked why he was so quiet, he told her he was studying. In truth, he was feeding the dark twin of his childhood loneliness, controlling the thing he could never control before, rejection. After that, something changed. The killings no longer felt like explosions of anger. They became deliberate. He learned from each one how to lure, how to clean up, how to dispose of evidence. Over the next 9 months, 6 more young women vanished. Aiko Koo, a 15-year-old dancer. Cindy Shaw, a college student whose remains were found on a cliffside. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, 2 friends picked up together on a rainy February night. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: the ride, the switch, the control, and then, always, the return home. Always back to his mother's house. It was as if every victim brought him closer to the real target. It wasn't about them, Ed confessed later. It was about her. Every woman I killed was my mother in pieces. He had begun projecting Clarnell's face onto every victim. The criticism, the rejection, the laughter, all replayed in his head with each new murder. He was killing the same ghost over and over, and the ghost never stayed dead. By 1973, the tension inside that small apartment on Orr Drive had reached its peak. Clarnell's taunts hadn't stopped. She mocked his job, his failed relationships, his quietness. One night in April, after a long day, Ed came home to find her drunk, reading in bed. She looked up and said, "Oh, I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now." He answered softly, "No, Mom. Good night." Hours later, while she slept, he returned with a claw hammer. He struck her once. Then again, when it was over, he said, "Thank you, Mom. Good night." He later decapitated her, a gruesome echo of the psychological beheading she'd inflicted for years. "She had to die," he told investigators. "She'd been dead to me for years." He wasn't done. He called his mother's best friend, Sarah Hallett, and invited her over, saying Clarnell wanted to see her. When she arrived, he strangled her too. Then he fled. For 3 days, no one knew where Ed Kemper was. He drove east, across Nevada, into Colorado, replaying everything in his mind like an old film reel. And then, just when the world expected another body, another headline, Ed Kemper did something no one predicted. He stopped at a payphone. He called the police. "I killed my mother," he said calmly, "and a friend of hers. I'm the one you're looking for." At first, they didn't believe him. They'd been drinking with him at the jury room bar just weeks earlier. He'd been the quiet giant who asked about the case, who offered theories. But this time, he wasn't theorizing. He was confessing. When officers arrested him, they said he seemed almost relieved. There was no struggle, no panic. Just a man who finally finished a story that had begun in a basement decades earlier. He confessed to 8 murders in chilling detail, describing not only the acts but the emotions behind them. "I was seeking control," he said, "over the one thing I couldn't control, her voice in my head." In that moment, the pattern became clear. The child who'd been told he was worthless had built a life around proving his mother wrong, and ended it by proving her right. He had become the very monster she said he'd be. The psychological dissection inside the mind of Ed Kemper, his intelligence, his manipulation, and how trauma rewired his sense of self. Santa Cruz County Jail, 1973. Edmund Kemper sits across from FBI agents. His hands are folded. His voice is steady. He doesn't look like a monster. He looks like a professor giving a lecture. "I'm not a lizard. I'm not an alien. I'm a man," he tells them. "I just had a problem with women." For hours, he talks calmly, intelligently, even politely about the murders, the psychology, the pain. Agents who've interviewed dozens of killers say they've never met anyone quite like him. Kemper isn't boasting. He's analyzing. It's as if he's studying himself. He explains how it started, how his mother's abuse became a voice in his head, how his fantasies filled the silence of childhood isolation, and how every act of violence was, in his words, a conversation with her ghost. To him, murder wasn't just physical, it was psychological communication. He killed the same person again and again, the woman who rejected him, humiliated him, abandoned him. "She kept talking in my head," he says in one interview. "Even after she was dead, she was still yelling at me." That's the paradox of Ed Kemper's mind. A man intelligent enough to understand his pathology, yet incapable of controlling it. Kemper's IQ was measured at 145, higher than most college professors. He could discuss philosophy, literature, and psychology with the same precision he used to describe dismemberment. He was calm, articulate, logical, and completely detached from human empathy. This is where childhood trauma becomes more than pain. It becomes reprogramming. When a child is told they're a monster, over and over, when love is replaced with ridicule, the brain adapts. It builds walls, thick, soundproof walls between emotion and action. So when that child grows up, they don't stop feeling. They stop identifying with the feeling. It's not that Ed Kemper didn't understand killing was wrong. He did. He just didn't feel connected to the idea of wrong. He once said, "I knew it was evil. I just didn't care, because caring hurt too much." When the FBI's behavioral science unit began building criminal profiles in the 1970s, Ed Kemper became one of their first subjects. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, the men who would later inspire Mindhunter, called him a cooperative study in pathology. He didn't hide anything. He explained his motives like equations. He described how he'd learned to fake remorse, how he'd practiced smiling in the mirror, how he'd use logic to mimic humanity. "If I smile, they trust me. If I ask questions, they think I care. If I listen, they tell me everything. Then I do what I came to do." In therapy sessions, Kemper showed that he understood the link between his childhood and his crimes. But the understanding didn't bring guilt. It brought clarity. He said, "She made me hate her, but she also made me love her because she was all I had. I could never kill her enough." That's what made Ed Kemper so terrifying. He wasn't insane. He was rational about his irrationality. He was a man who could articulate horror with the vocabulary of a psychologist. During interviews, he sometimes smiled, not with pride, but with recognition, as if reliving the logic behind his choices. He told one psychiatrist, "I'm not sorry I killed her. I'm sorry it had to happen that way." To Kemper, morality was transactional. If he could justify the act emotionally, it became rational. That's the danger of trauma unhealed. It teaches the brain to build logic around pain until the pain feels like purpose. Psychologists have debated for decades whether Ed Kemper was a psychopath or a deeply traumatized narcissist. The truth is likely both. His childhood didn't excuse his crimes, but explains the transformation from victim of abuse to abuser of life itself. He once summarized his mind in a single chilling line: "When I killed them, they were alive in me, When they were gone, I was empty again. That emptiness, that craving to feel full, to feel powerful, became his engine. It's what separates remorse from reflection. Ed Kemper could reflect on everything, but he could never feel it. And that silence, that void where empathy should live, is the final scar of childhood abuse. It doesn't just wound the body, it rewires the soul. After his confession, Ed Kemper was tried for 8 counts of murder. The courtroom was silent each time he spoke, calm, courteous, intelligent. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man explaining a theory. Psychiatrists testified that Kemper was fully sane, fully aware of what he'd done. The jury agreed. On November 8, 1973, Edmund Emil Kemper III was found guilty and sentenced to 8 life sentences, to be served concurrently at California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He was 24 years old. The boy who once lived in his mother's basement now lived behind bars, a cage made of steel instead of fear. Inside prison, Kemper was different from other inmates. He was polite to guards, respected by fellow prisoners, and often used for psychological observation. He volunteered for programs, recorded audiobooks for the blind, and spent hours talking with criminologists. To some, he seemed reformed. To others, he was simply adapting. The same intelligence that once fooled doctors now disarming his captors. When asked why he cooperated so openly, Kemper said, "It's the least I can do. I already know what I am." Even behind bars, he continued to analyze himself. He described his crimes with the same precision a surgeon might use to discuss anatomy. He showed remorse in words, but not in emotion. "There's no reason to pretend," he said once. "You can't undo a storm. You can only study the wreckage." That wreckage, his past, was something he revisited often. In interviews, he talked about his childhood, about Clarnell, about the basement. He spoke of the loneliness, the constant ridicule, the isolation that defined his earliest years. "I didn't have a childhood," he said. "I had a training ground." And that statement, cold, concise, devastating, captures the truth of trauma's legacy. It's easy to dismiss men like Ed Kemper as born evil. It's easier still to believe that monsters emerge fully formed. But the reality is more complex and far more terrifying. Monsters are made, stitched together from neglect, abuse, humiliation, and rage. And when society fails to see the warning signs, those stitches come apart. In Kemper's case, the signs were there from the beginning. The cruelty to animals, the obsession with death, the absence of affection. Yet no one intervened. No one helped him process the pain. Instead, his mother's words became his internal monologue. Her rejection became his worldview. And every act of violence he committed was a twisted attempt to make the pain visible. But here's the cruel irony. The child who longed to be heard became the man everyone wanted to listen to, from behind bars. He became one of the FBI's most valuable psychological subjects. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler visited him often. They used his insights to profile other killers, men like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Dennis Rader. Kemper helped them understand how violent fantasies evolve, how charm hides pathology, and how early trauma can build a bridge to later predation. In many ways, the co-ed killer helped shape modern criminal profiling. His darkness became data. "You learn early that love hurts," Kemper once said. "And when that's all you know, you make other people feel it too." That statement, calm, clinical, captures the cycle perfectly. Pain begets pain. Abuse becomes imitation. And without intervention, the victim and the perpetrator merge into one. Decades later, Ed Kemper remains in prison, now in his 70s. He reads, he writes, he sometimes grants interviews, but he no longer seeks attention. He once told a journalist, "I'm not looking for forgiveness. I'm looking for understanding." And that's where the story of Ed Kemper ceases to be just about him and becomes about us, because understanding doesn't mean excusing. It means recognizing the cracks before they widen. It means seeing the boy in the basement before he becomes a man in the headlines. In the end, Ed Kemper's life is a study in echoes. The echo of a mother's voice that never stopped. The echo of trauma passed from parent to child. The echo of silence, the world's failure to listen until it was too late. If violence is a language, then trauma is its dialect. And Ed Kemper spoke it fluently. "I didn't start out to be a killer," he said. "I started out as a kid who wanted someone to stop me. Maybe that's the real horror. Not that he killed, but that no one stopped him when there was still time." If you found this story unsettling, remember, it's not just about one man's evil. It's about what happens when pain goes unheard, when the child's cry becomes the killer's confession. This is Criminal Mindset. If you found this story meaningful and compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.